This is a Glassbox Media podcast.
Welcome to another exciting episode of the Business of Sound. My name is David Segura. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Glassbox Media and the host of this podcast. Our goal as always is to provide you with actionable tips that ultimately will help you in the podcast industry, whether you're a marketer, podcast host, or something else. We invite you to join us every month or as frequent as we publish as we bring you these expert insights to conduct exclusive interviews with some of the industry's leading voices. But before we get started, please hit the subscribe button and give us a 5-star rating to stay up to date with all the latest episodes of The Business of Sound. Today, we have a very special episode, and I'm personally very excited to be interviewing one of our favorite podcasters, and that's Gary from Everything Everywhere Daily. And he's got an incredibly impressive record. We're going to talk about a variety of subjects, including his favorite ad campaign, favorite ad read, and much, much more. So without further ado, let's dive right in. First of all, Gary, thank you for coming on to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, always. You know, just to dive into the subject of the show, we're obviously going to talk about, your background, your story, and why you got into podcasting. But I just want to ask you just straight up, because I've really talked to a lot of creators that have almost a love-hate relationship with advertisers. How do you feel about incorporating brands into your vision and basically your programming?
I have no problem with it whatsoever. When I launched this show from episode number 1, I put an ad in it, even though I didn't have advertisers, because I wanted to establish the fact that this was an advertising-based show from the get-go. I know a lot of podcasters who don't have ads, and then they grow their show, and then they're tentative about it, like, oh, well, what is my audience going to think? I just took that off the table immediately by putting ads in from the start. And initially, they were for a product I had of my own, the Travel Photography Academy. I did affiliate programs and signed up for it, things I thought were a good fit for the site, and just did those. And so once I started actually selling ads, it was a pretty seamless transition, and no one, even commented on it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good approach. I mean, I don't want to use too strong a term like condition, but I really do think audiences these days should understand that great content that requires extensive research, passion, does take funding. And one of the most obvious ways for media from, the very beginning of it has been to incorporate brands and to do it in a tasteful fashion. So, I think I'm preaching to the choir, but let's just say I agree with you. And I appreciate that.
Well, I mean, if you look back at the history of broadcast media, not even broadcast media, but even just kind of media in general, when we go back to the first newsletters and news sheets back in the 18th century, they had advertising. So it's something that it's difficult to do without. You're seeing problems with a lot of streaming services nowadays that everyone thought, oh, we get away from cable and you can just buy everything a la carte. And then, the amount you end up paying for streaming services ends up being the same as what you were paying for cable. So I've never had a problem with it. I think it's something that works really well. And I've had very little in the way of complaints, to be completely honest. There are always a few people, said, well, maybe if you just had 30 seconds of ads, I would listen. I'm like, well, if I just had 30 seconds worth of ads, the show wouldn't exist. And they just don't understand the economics of it.
I think it makes perfect sense. And as long as people can be made to understand that, that's a great thing. I kind of feel like podcasting audiences especially understand it because, as you mentioned, it's very similar to broadcast radio. And I think beyond that too, they, appreciate, a lot of the advertisers basically kind of lending their support to creators they respect. So that's great for everybody.
Yeah. And if you look at a lot of and I know you're familiar with all the data, podcasting is one of the most effective advertising platforms out there. And one of the reason is the fact that you have host-read ads, something that you don't see in most, radio or television media. They just run these prepackaged ads, and that's what people are accustomed to. Whereas with podcasting, it can be much more personal. And I think that's one of the reasons it's so successful.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's actually something that makes a lot of sense. So, the more folks embrace it, there's ways to shape it, customize it, make it consistent with your show and a value add as opposed to detraction from. But I think it's a very flexible medium. Before we dive in a little bit more to this topic, I do want to take a step back. And I know I've asked you this before, but for the audience, I want to know kind of why you decided to get into podcasting and what kind of kept you motivated. Because as you know, it's a lot more work than people realize, and there's always a lot of time before you find that sweet spot. So I want to know like why you got into it, and to this day or back then, what was your motivation?
I had a very successful blog. So I started a travel blog back in 2006. I traveled around the world for 13 years. The blog was very successful. Time Magazine named it one of the top 25 blogs in the world back in 2010. But the blogging landscape changed, and it changed dramatically. It used to be that when I started it, that was social media. People came to your blog to see what you had to say, and you could write about things from a personal basis. You didn't have to worry about SEO. And then when Twitter and Facebook started to rise in prominence, people began to go there rather than your website. And then they started choking off access to things because they had an algorithm, and then you had to pay to get your message out to people that were following you anyhow. And what happened is then most traffic to blogs started to come through Google, and Google had an algorithm, and then you had to appease that algorithm. And the next thing you know, 10 years later, people are writing things for an algorithm, not for people. And this was not really what I had ever signed up for. The only place where you could reach people on a personal level and not have to worry about algorithms, they're there a little bit, but not very much, is podcasting. You could, I can have my own voice and not have it filtered. I literally have to please humans, not an algorithm, in every episode of my show. And it seemed like a natural thing for me to do. And way back in the day, in high school and college, I was one of the top academic debaters and public speakers in the country. So this is something that I've always felt comfortable doing. And it was I just felt it was a natural thing for me to get into. And I had been podcasting a long time. I started a show back in 2009 called This Week in Travel. We never made any money off of it, but I was very familiar with the podcasting landscape. I've been listening to podcasts for 20 years now, ever since they first came out. And I had a fairly good idea of what would work and how to make it happen. So when I came up for the idea of this, so when the pandemic hit, I really had to pivot. And I had this idea for my show in my back pocket. And I was like, well, this is the time to do it. And so I just went all in.
It's amazing. So that track record is obviously more extensive and long-lived than a lot of other folks, but it makes perfect sense that you'd see this as a medium that you could adapt well to. I will say on my side, I did some college debate, but a lot in high school as well. So I'm not quite as immersed as you are, but hey, running a podcast company, it's close enough for me.
No, and even to this day, I tell people that is a huge part of, I think, the success of my show. There's a lot of history podcasters that are very boring to listen to because they seem like they're reading a script. And one of the things I tell other podcasters is you're putting on a performance. That's really what you're doing. It's not acting maybe, but it's also not acting. And your ability to use vocal inflection and to just add a richness to it through your voice is really important.
I couldn't agree more. With that in mind, there's part of what motivated this episode for today, frankly, is our producer just kind of getting a lot of feedback from folks in the industry, both podcasters and, believe it or not, even executives alike, asking, I guess, how to navigate kind of the ad read space. So in other words, really making sure that the reads are great, high quality, and that they make sense for the show. One comment I'll make about, your show in particular is that it's shorter in length, dare I say it's snackable. And so for that reason, you have a very definite idea of how many ads, can be sustained by the show. And you kind of thought a lot about how to incorporate that. So before we dive right into the mechanics of the read, what makes a good read versus what doesn't, can you give me your thoughts on how a podcaster should maybe think about how many ads make sense for my show, or how should I think about monetization in general for a podcast?
Well, there's a couple ways you can monetize. And I think that I've always thought that there are two ends of a spectrum. There's a show like mine, which has a very broad appeal and is going to have a much larger audience, and those are well suited for advertising. And most of the very popular podcasts you can think of tend to fall into that category. Then there are niche podcasts that are much smaller. They tend to be very focused, and they're probably going to make money selling a product or a service. So if you have something that's a podcast tailored to accountants, maybe even in one specific area of accounting, you may not have a very large audience because there just isn't a large universe of people who can listen to your show. But those people could be very motivated to buy something that's very high value. And so I've met podcasters that may only have 500 to 1,000 downloads an episode, but they're making six figures precisely because of that kind of business model. So I do think you need to think about the business model before you launch the show. I see a lot of people that are just, I want to start a podcast. And if you have that attitude, it's probably just going to be a hobby podcast. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's probably what it's going to be. I thought of the business aspect of this from day one, and I still haven't even implemented a lot of the things that I think I can do in terms of monetization, because I've been so focused on growing the show than some of the other things. So yeah, that's what was the other part of the question again?
I think you basically nailed it, because we do get a lot of feedback and requests. I think respectfully, not everyone, but a lot of people are looking for silver bullets. We're the first to let them know that there are none. It's going to be not only hard, but probably, double the difficulty or time length that they think. Sustainability. We do think.
You asked about the number of ads per show. I don't think there's any sort of golden rule for that. I knew that for a show of 10 minutes, which is approximately the length of most of my shows, 2 ads was going to pretty much be the limit. And I knew I've listened to other daily shows that had more. And if you look at their ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts, they were very low. They were like 4.2, and almost all the negative reviews had to do with the number of ads. So I determined early on, okay, 2 is going to be the number. And as you know, I could probably sell a third slot. So there's money that's being left on the table, but I also think it would hurt the show. And so I've just stuck to that. 2 is the number that it's going to be. And I think however you have your show, you have to figure out what that is. And you also have to figure out before you start production, where are the ads going to go? Because one of the most annoying things is when ads are inserted seemingly randomly in a conversation. I have a specific place in my show where the ads go, and it's always been there ever, in all 1,200 episodes I've done. It's in the same spot. And so it doesn't interrupt the flow. It's not intrusive. It doesn't bother people. Yet I clearly know from the data that people are listening, largely because most of them are in my voice and it's me talking.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And just to add to that for the audience, I think you said it all, and I think it's very clear, but there really are some podcasts out there that, with respect are great. People are putting their time and their passion into it, but they really do have ads, whether they're host read or, programmatic, in other words, brand recorded ads, literally cut off content. And we're all doing our best. Everyone's learning, but I do urge all podcast hosts and producers to kind of take the time to do a play out, or like Gary mentioned, have a specific section of the pod where you're going to have your ads. Because from a user experience standpoint, you can tolerate that a few times. Mistakes are obviously going to be made, but if it happens frequently, you kind of wonder what is the brand or, the advertisement do for the show if it's just kind of interrupting the flow. So that's critical. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Every TV and radio program plans for an ad break. They may do it on the basis of time. Okay, at 15 minutes past the hour, we have to have an ad break, and the host will say, we'll be right back after this message from our sponsor, or something like that. But it's planned for, and it doesn't just interrupt the flow of what's happening. And I think podcasters simply need to adopt that practice.
Couldn't agree more. With that in mind, we've done a number of campaigns with you in the show. I think you've hit it out of the ballpark on literally too many to count, but for any number of reasons, maybe because it was commercially rewarding, maybe because it was a unique experience. What's been the most memorable in your opinion?
It would have to be one of the ads I did for ButcherBox. I am a big fan of ButcherBox. I really do like their product. That's not just, me saying that because they're an advertiser. I just had a butcher box steak last night. That's the last meal I've eaten. And they're also pretty open in terms of the creative. So I can pretty much do what I want. They may have a special that they're running. And, so long as you mentioned the basics, you have a free reign to talk about whatever you want. And a couple months ago, they had an offer where they were giving away free ground beef with every box. And so I just mentioned this thing I made. I think other people have done it, but I just sort of invented it myself. What I called a meat donut, which is nothing more than taking ground beef and instead of putting it into a patty, you put it into the shape of a donut. And then in the middle, you cook an egg, and then you take another fried egg and put it on top. I said, that's my meat donut. And you guys can do whatever you want. You can do other things. I've talked about making Scotch eggs. And after I did the meat donut spot, I had people literally sending me pictures of meat donuts that they were making, which, shows that they're listening to the ad, if nothing else.
That's amazing. Yeah, I do remember that campaign. And for the record, you already know this, but not only was I well received and creative, but it worked. In other words, it actually drove a lot of subscriptions to Butcher Box, which, was thrilling for both of us, but especially for them, I imagine.
Yeah, and I think some of the most famous ads in podcast, I don't know if you're familiar with the Bill Burr ad for Sherry's Berries. It's a classic ad. He's reading it, and it's as if he didn't know who the advertiser was. It's like, okay, time for the ad. And he starts reading it verbatim, like off a piece of paper. And while he's reading it, because it basically, they send strawberries that are dipped in chocolate. And he's reading it. He's inserting his commentary. It's like, what must you have done in order to have to ship this to your wife? And it's this hilarious ad. He goes way off script. And most advertisers would have probably panicked. Sherry's Berries loved it because it went viral and it resulted in sales because people learned about the product and they were selling it. And he also hit on, a truth that if you have to order this, it's the equivalent of flowers or something like that. You probably did something wrong. And it did really well. But by going off script and doing something that, quite frankly, most advertisers never would have thought to have done, it worked, incredibly successfully. And it was probably the most successful ad they ever had.
That's great. I mean, I will say this, it takes guts. And one comment I'll throw out there, and, every brand's different. Every brand profile is different. And that means risk or whatever. As an example, my co-founder here at Glassbox, Chris Whitman, used to work at the agency that did all the media planning for J&J. Don't get me wrong. Amazing company, pretty much a bedrock of Americana, basically. But they're conservative. And I don't mean that politically. I just mean that they don't like to take too many risks. They're very protective, and they'd probably be less okay with a very, very heavy ad lib. On the flip side, some of these emerging brands, these challenger brands, ButcherBox included, they will embrace that. And I think you just have to figure out your tolerance and kind of what you're willing to accept. But on a personal level, obviously I'm biased. I do think empowering creators to kind of take chances and do their thing, it's the right play. They know their audience better, frankly, than any brand strategist would. So I love to see examples of that. And not only that, but when they win. So the meat donut, great example. And then obviously kudos to Bill Burr, who takes chances all the time. One story.
There are some companies that are in highly regulated environments. And I understand that they don't have a lot of latitude with what you can say. You cannot use certain words because it's a highly regulated, maybe it's a financial product or a medical product or whatever. And that's understandable. They can't. But I do think then that there are a lot that can. You guys, I think back in the day, you mentioned you were responsible for the Dollar Shave Club ad. And again, a hilarious ad that probably never would have been, proposed, to a Johnson & Johnson or some big, company that has a brand. But as a young upstart company, you can get away with that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah, very much so. I remember those days. Yeah, the giant media company, we're in the video space, and basically all credit to the CEO of Dollar Shave Club, Mike Dubin. Great guy, just fantastic leader. But our role there was very similar to Glassbox. We were in charge of distribution and marketing for that. And honestly, we didn't have to do too much. It went viral very much on its own. But to his point, he was trying to be true to the brand but also irreverent. And that entire brand is built in his personality. And what a lot of people don't know about Mike is that Mike's actually a trained improv actor and comedian. So the reason it came across as so natural is that it was. He is and I mean this as a compliment, kind of like a smart ass, very ironic, kind of basically came across slightly exaggerated in his ad, but not too much. And I think that's why it resonated. So we love to see that.
When a lot of ads or a lot of companies are doing podcast promotions, they're doing very wide promotions across a lot of different podcasts and with a lot of different networks. And so they're looking to just sort of spread things as wide as possible. And as a result, there is a very set format for doing podcast ads that kind of exist. So they can just give the same sheet to every podcaster. It's like, okay, here's your call to action. Make sure to say this, blah, blah, blah. It's going to be this amount of time. What I would like to see that is, I think, good for my show is far more customization and integration with my podcast. So before I came to you guys, I began doing a partnership with the Tourist Office of Spain. And they were like, Gary, we want to support your show. How do you want to do this? And I suggested, well, how about I do a sponsored episode? The entire episode will be something about Spain. And they were like, fine. We don't even care what you talk about, so long as it has something to do with Spain, because we just want to pique people's interest. And I'm like, yeah, I'll do a normal 60-second ad, but then the whole podcast will be about it. And I think there's a lot of opportunities like that for, especially with a show like mine, which is literally about everything. But most advertisers are still so focused on just repeating that same sort of 60-second ad on every podcast that they're not really looking at creatively how they could do things different. Not just for my show, but I think for other shows as well, in terms of integrating the product, in terms of advertising types. One thing I think could be done is, because I have a show that comes out every day and it's rather short, there's a possibility of doing something, maybe not a third ad, but maybe 2.1 ads, like a short 10 to 15 second thing. This ad, this episode is brought to you by Coca-Cola, who encourages you to drink Coke and smile. Just a, very short thing, but what you're shooting for is consistency. So you do it every episode for 30 to 60 days or something like that. So it's shorter, but you have more of it. I've never seen a company do something like that, but I think there's an opportunity for something like that. I think there's an opportunity for longer, more in-depth ads, sponsored episodes, a whole host of things. But you're just not seeing a lot of creativity from the advertiser's part in terms of experimenting with the formats.
I'd agree with that. And I think, surprisingly, more advertisers are open to experimentation than others. Definitely as it comes to the read. Usually if we push them, there's feedback that certain lines or CTAs, called actions, have to be read exactly as is. But otherwise, there's a lot of license. In terms of the second thing, that'd be more exciting, I think. Let's do something that's a deeper integration, somewhat custom, almost like 2.1 ads per show in your case. That surprisingly takes more time, not because they don't think it's a great idea, but all the sign-offs required. But I do think it's a great point, because I think the whole industry, including us, are very much moving towards that. I think podcasting is a unique medium, and as long as it's scalable, the more customization we can do, probably the better. And it'll ultimately impact conversions, which is what they want anyway. So I think we're on the same page there, and that's definitely something I think not only we can work together on, but the whole industry. I'd love to see other people kind of follow there. And I think there's been some decent examples of some companies that have done that pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, I think, you have, and you've probably seen this too. There are certain companies that kind of everyone knows who do a lot of podcast advertising. And then there are companies that basically do no podcast advertising. And it'd also be nice to see more people get into the ecosystem. You read so much about the effectiveness of podcast advertising, and then I've often wondered why you don't see bigger brands, brands that you see everywhere else on radio and television, not, putting money into podcasting.
It's a great question. And, that's one of our kind of central dilemmas. And I say that with maybe it's too dramatic a word, but at Giant as an example, that's where we lived. Brand awareness, top 100 TV advertisers, they all embraced online video, even in the early days. But with podcasting, they're getting there. So the short answer is we're working with folks like Hyundai and Heineken, and they're embracing it too. but it's been a little bit slower than we would have expected. But nonetheless, people go where the attention is. And I just think given how fast podcast is growing, it's inevitable. And I think as soon as next year, we're going to start to see a lot of the top brands really embrace this space. And I think in a good way for everybody, create competition. And that basically means there'll be more innovation around advertising formats, customizations, host reads, you name it. So just saying that out loud makes me excited. So future's bright.
I hope so. Yeah. Everything's pointing in the right direction.
Absolutely. With that in mind, Gary, I want to thank you again for coming on. And before we kind of do our sign out, I did want to ask you, just in closing, was there any additional advice that you'd give to established and even budding podcasters out there as they start to think a little bit more about their host read and ad strategy in general?
Ideally, you want to plan, like I said, plan it before you ever launch your show. And you need to give the growth of the show time. Too many people give up too quickly, that they don't see immediate success. And that is not how podcasting works. This is not YouTube. Podcast episodes don't go viral in the same way that YouTube videos go viral. It's steady, and it's going to probably take you at least 18 months to get to a point where you can build an audience where you can probably start selling ads. So, and I knew this from day one. So I was just like, all right, I'm going to, lock myself in a room for a year and a half and focus on the show and grow it. And, you don't have to lock yourself in a room, but that is, it is going to take time, and you have to plan for that. And if you're not planning for the, at least, like I said, a year and a half for the show to reach that critical point, then you're probably not going to succeed.
I think that says it all. At the end of the day, it is an intense investment. It doesn't really have to be just financial. There's other ways to do it, and promise it'll be hard work. So as long as they're determined, I couldn't agree with that advice more. Thanks a lot, Gary. And I guess with that in mind, thank you to the audience for listening to another week of The Business of Sound. As always, this show is produced by Erica Miranda, and the new episodes were released on Thursdays, typically at this point anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks, and then obviously as often as we can. We ask you to leave us a 5-star review if you feel you've gotten some value from the show, and we encourage you to follow Glassbox Media on Instagram or LinkedIn. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.